Right, so as we know, the UK joined in with the US in attacks on Houthis in Yemen the other night, resulting in 10 targets being hit, and early reports of at least 5 Houthis having been killed and more injured. Again, it's worth reiterating that the Houthi blockade to Israeli shipping in the Red Sea hadn't killed anyone. But the only fatalities have been Houthi ones at the hands of the US at sea and at the hands of both the US and the UK in Yemen itself. This has, of course, been presented as necessary because the Houthis are a danger to shipping, but when actually it was only Israeli shipping traffic that was being affected. That other traffic could travel freely. This was an obvious siding with Israel, on trial for genocide in The Hague, as they were at the time of these strikes, in the name of preserving their economy, placing Israel's economic needs over the ethnic cleansing happening in Gaza. But commentary from an American convert to Islam, the human rights activist Shahid Bolzan, in relation to this attack on Yemen has actually got people thinking of something else driving this. A much darker motivation in relation to Israel for the UK and the US to be pursuing this action against Yemen. And it's probably something we all need to be aware of. Right, so the bombing in Yemen has appalled and disgusted most people following the situation in the Middle East right now, with Israel still committing genocide in Gaza even whilst they are on trial for genocide. Yemen blockading Israeli shipping, causing Israel economic problems, and of course the US and the UK flying in to rescue the genocidalists by picking a fight with the Houthis of Yemen, who would have stopped their attacks anyway upon Israel, ending its attacks in Gaza, instead of the US and UK demanding Israel do that too. Lives would not have been lost, and the UK wouldn't have made itself now a target for its shipping trying to pass through the Red Sea, as the Yemeni Houthis have now declared. If the US and UK thought this attack on Yemen would make them stop, they really don't understand their enemy here. Yemen, Houthis, they don't give a shit. I've used the honey badger reference to these guys before, tenacious and never quitting, and it fits. Because if Western leaders think they've achieved anything here, then they're idiots. All they've achieved is to make the Red Sea more impassable to more shipping traffic than it was before, and if they escalate to all-out war there, no shipping will get through at all. Everybody will be suffering economic knock-on hits. And for what? Deciding war is more preferable than telling Israel to end its genocide. Stupid just isn't a big enough word. They, of course, claim they did this to stop any more attacks by the Houthis. The opposite is all they will have achieved. All our government can say on the matter, via the unelected Foreign Secretary David Cameron, is to promise more attacks if Yemen don't stop. Well, they won't stop, and they won't stop if you attack them again either. Reinforcing this idiocy, possibly, and this is admittedly unverified, is a report from Yemen saying that one of the targets hit by UK Paveway 4 missiles amounted to destroying 5 tents. About $500 worth of tents destroyed with about £6 million worth of arsenal. If true, as I say, it's unverified at this point, but there are apparently photos, so we'll see if they turn up online, then that again reinforces the sheer expense and waste involved in fighting Yemen, who, as we know, have had the US shooting down $100 drones in the Red Sea with millions of dollars worth of weaponry and missiles. It's a stupidly costly action for the West to be taking for a net zero result. But is this really all about being on Israel's side here? These attacks came in the night after South Africa's excellent, detailed and forensic case against Israel in The Hague. And Shahid Bolzan, an American Islam convert and human rights activist, predominantly on Middle Eastern matters where he has lived, and he now operates a YouTube channel called Middle Nation. He's weighed in on what has happened in Yemen and drawn the dots to the case happening in the International Court of Justice. And what he's come up with I found rather interesting. He said, "It's understood that the ICJ is a political institution and its rulings are heavily political and subject to political pressure. So people have wondered, and reasonably so, what are the chances that they will actually rule against Israel, while Israel has always been fully backed by the Western powers? And the ICJ has become regarded as a tool of the Western powers, particularly of the United States. Well, you didn't have to wait for very long to see which way the court was likely to go. First of all, the evidence that's being presented by South Africa is absolutely irrefutable and damning. Their case is supremely well evidenced and meticulously detailed, and literally cites the genocidal words of Israeli officials themselves, including Netanyahu himself, and directly connects those words with the actions of the Israeli military in Gaza, So it's absolutely a devastating case, and it is impossible, frankly, to argue against it. Certainly it's impossible to argue against it with any degree of seriousness or with any comparable standard of evidence and reason as is being presented by the prosecution. Just from the first day of testimony, Israel and the United States were completely and immaculately defeated. And if you had any doubt that they realized this, that Israel and the United States realized this, then there's nothing that could have proved it more than what the US did later that day, that evening, that same evening. They attacked Yemen. They attacked Yemen because they knew they're going to lose in the International Court of Justice. This is very desperate, a very pathetic form of doubling down. Imagine their response to the irrefutable proof of genocide in Gaza is to escalate and to expand the violence to defend the genocide. They cannot defend the genocide in court, so they decide to compound the brutality by spreading it. They defend carnage by means of carnage. That's the American way. They've lost the support of the world because they lost the awe of the world. They lost the respect of the world, and they lost the fear of the world. They're backed into a corner in the world court, and they're being exposed, or they're being ensnared by the very system that they created. The system that they created to protect their impunity and to prosecute their opponents. The mechanisms of law they constructed to oppress and to prosecute and to immunize themselves is now being turned against them. So they resort to what they always resorted to. They resort to what they created the whole system to enable them to do, which is savage, primitive brute force and violence. The layers are being peeled away, the veneers being stripped off. America has been king of the hill for all these years, and they're being pulled down that hill, and all they can do is lash out. What we're seeing right now is a victory. Their vicious, barbaric instincts are only accelerating their downfall. By attacking Yemen, they're just showing the world and showing the world court that yes, it is genocide in Gaza, and it is genocide in Gaza because we think our capacity for violence makes us superior, and our capacity for violence entitles us to be violent, and so what? What are you going to do about it, world? Because what are the Houthis doing except trying to stop the genocide? One of this guy Shahid Balsan's influences, and actually what set him on the path to Islam in part, as he himself has cited, was Malcolm X. And if you listen to the guy speak for yourself on his YouTube channel, he even speaks like Malcolm X. He's got the same inflections there. But he exposes here a bigger point. Israel is stuffed at the ICJ. So many of us have thought that. They are so very badly stuffed that no matter how politically influenced the ICJ might be, and it has faced many accusations of being a US puppet court. The court president right now is literally an American, which has just compounded that. But the Bolson actually thinks that the ruling is just academic at this point. It's a foregone conclusion. Israel's defense used all the debunked nonsense they spread on social media and thinks a court will hold it up as irrefutable evidence. Whereas Bolson also maintains it's a US-controlled construct. Therefore, perhaps Israel figure that will shield them again. It won't. Not if the ICJ wants to maintain any kind of semblance of justice actually being done and then being relevant in any way, shape or form, because to rule in favour of Israel will be seen as so ridiculous the world would never take the ICJ seriously ever again. Bolson asserts, therefore, that the attack on Yemen amounts to not just a distraction, but a show of force saying we're in charge here and what we say goes, and balls to whatever the court might say at this point. It's a very worrying assertion because it implies the US, and in all likelihood the UK, would act in such a manner that they would completely ignore any ruling handed down by the International Court of Justice. Now, whether that ruling gets enforced by the UN is a complete other matter, of course. The Security Council would see it vetoed. Almost certainly the US would veto it. The UK would likely join them in that now, or at the very least abstain again. But it could, according to the lawyer who successfully sued Yugoslavia under the Genocide Convention, Francis Boyle, over their war crimes in the Balkans, see it pushed through under the Uniting for Peace Treaty. But what then? Would it just still be ignored? Well, Bolson thinks yes, and frankly, who would bet against that? But it will send a message to the rest of the world that it wouldn't just be Israel then committing genocide, would it? Are our politicians stupid enough to back this and end up accused of the same crimes Israel is right now? Yes, sadly, of course they are. Sunak and Cameron, or human rights lawyer Keir Starmer, the supposed opposition Labour leader, they would all do it. If Israel gets ruled against by the ICJ as expected, and Biden, for example, said let's bomb Yemen again over that, then our leaders here would jump immediately and join him. Should that scenario come to pass, what value then is there on global justice if the West just ignores it when it doesn't go their way? If Yemen was distraction and a warning of things to come, matters could become so much worse after the ICJ ruling gets made, assuming, as everybody thinks it will, it goes against Israel. And if you want to know just how awful the Israeli defence actually was that made Shahid Bolson and many others, myself included, think this is just a matter of formality before the ICJ is sent to South Africa's provisional order, then you should watch this video next, where I covered all of that, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next bit. Cheers, folks. Right, so earlier this evening I put out a video where the expectation is that Israel will lose their case against South Africa in The Hague, and provisional orders will be granted by the court to end the ceasefire, amongst other things. And I talked about how the attack on Yemen by US and UK forces was something of a distraction, and also how it was a show of defiance against a judicial ruling they will in all likelihood flout. They aren't of course saying that, they're claiming they are defending global shipping, even though actually they are very much screwing it up with their activities in the Red Sea. But it's being read as a shot across the bowels of anyone who thinks they will take any notice of the ICJ. If they carry on, or escalate, the Red Sea will become impassable for everyone. But the West aren't stupid enough to overtly come out and say they'll just ignore the judicial ruling. But unfortunately for them, somebody else is stupid enough to come right out and say it. And that person has been Benjamin Netanyahu. Right, so whilst the US and UK are playing damage limitation for Israel, still committing genocide in Gaza by deciding to bomb Yemen ahead of an expected legal finding against Israel on charges of genocide, Benjamin Netanyahu took to TV to just come out and say, we're going to ignore the ruling. Nothing quite says we've already lost than that, does it? It ought to harden the resolve of the court judges, really, but they'll have to pretend he didn't say anything, though I suppose, having come out and said what he has, he can later accuse the court of being biased against Israel by taking into account things not said in the courtroom. Not that that will wash either. Well, Netanyahu took to Israeli TV last night to address the nation. A nation in Israel, a people growing in number, protesting his premiership, wanting him gone and a new set of elections held, but he's ignoring that as well. He went on TV to say, citizens of Israel, today we mark 100 days of the war. 100 days since the terrible day on which our citizens were massacred and taken hostage. We are continuing the war until the end, until total victory, until we achieve all of our goals, eliminating Hamas, returning all of our hostages, and ensuring that Gaza will never again constitute a threat to Israel. We will restore security to both the south and the north. Nobody will stop us. Not The Hague, not the axis of evil, and not anybody else. The hypocritical onslaught at The Hague against the state of the Jews that arose from the ashes of the Holocaust at the behest of those who came to perpetrate another Holocaust against the Jews is a moral low point in the history of nations. In the murder tunnels of Gaza, our forces have found copies of Hitler's Mein Kampf. In a home in Gaza, they found a child's tablet with a picture of Hitler as the screensaver. Not for nothing did German Chancellor Scholz, after viewing the atrocities of the October 7th massacre, say, Hamas are the new Nazis. Yesterday I spoke with Chancellor Scholz and I thanked him for Germany's willingness to send a delegation to The Hague to help refute this despicable lie. But see the depth of the absurdity and the hypocrisy. Supporters of the new Nazis dare to accuse us of genocide. Who do they support? Murderers, rapists, those who decapitate and those who burn babies? What brazen gall! What a disgrace! The State of Israel, the IDF and our security services are fighting a moral and just war that is without parallel against the Hamas monsters, the new Nazis. This international campaign of denigration will not weaken either our hand or our determination to fight until the end, because something has changed in the history of our people. The anti-Semitism is the same anti-Semitism, but the status of the Jewish people has fundamentally changed. Today we have a state. We have defence forces and heroic soldiers to protect our people. What happened on October 7th will not happen again. This is our mission, our obligation. Tomorrow we will submit a budget that will ensure the continuation of the war. More money, a lot more, for security. More compensation and grants for reservists, families, the self-employed, and for all who are bearing the burden. More assistance to return evacuees to their homes and for rebuilding the communities and the kibbutzim. We are on the path to victory. We will not stop until we achieve victory. We are doing this together to the end. I believe in our people, in our soldiers and commanders, and I believe that after the massacre of October 7th, we will not compromise on anything less than total victory. I say this on your behalf to every world leader who I speak with. We will not compromise and we will not stop. We are continuing until victory. We have no other choice. In recent weeks, we have proven to Hamas and Hezbollah that every terrorist is a dead man, wherever they are. We are continuing to eliminate many terrorists, and we are doing so in two ways. In forceful military activity, in which most Hamas battalions have been eliminated, and clearing actions to eliminate additional terrorists left in the field, above and below ground. These actions take time. Several days ago, I met with Secretary of State Blinken. I thanked him for the American assistance, and I emphasised to him, we were embarked on this war after we were massacred. We are not stopping. We are continuing until we eliminate Hamas and return our hostages. I told him something else. This is not just our war, it is also your war. This is the war of the sons of light against the sons of darkness. This is a war against the axis of evil led by Iran and its three proxies, Hezbollah, Hamas and the Houthis. And I added, I do not forget, not even for a moment, that in addition to the war in Gaza, in addition to the return of our hostages and the return of the residents to their homes in both the north and south, we have another, constant, existential mission to prevent Iran from attaining nuclear weapons. This is my mission. This is our mission. I told Secretary of State Blinken, this needs to be your highest mission too. I embrace the families of the hostages with whom I and my wife meet all the time. These are personal, heart-rending meetings. We embrace them and listen to them. We look at the photos of their loved ones, our loved ones. I gave them a clear promise and I repeat it today. I will not give up on anyone. We are obligated to returning them all home. I embrace the wounded who have shown utmost heroism in the face of their war injuries. Every one of our fighters and commanders are true heroes who have given their souls to restore security to our country and return the residents to their homes. And so it will be. Absolutely insane. Nobody will stop us, not even The Hague. Well, nothing quite says we're a law-abiding, non-genocidal state, quite like saying, sod the law. But there we go. Not the axis of evil either, he said. Well, who be they then? But saying the World Court ruling against them won't stop the genocide is just off the charts nuts. You have to bear in mind that every country signed up to the Genocide Convention has a responsibility under that convention to uphold it. A court ruling under that convention places that responsibility on every country signed up to it. That's why the US and now the UK are in dire straits potentially for aiding and abetting in all of this. And they just doubled down on that when they took the fight to Yemen. But every other country signed up should, in theory, seek to enforce the ruling. Now, whether they will or not is another matter. They may wish to not escalate matters militarily. But on the other hand, the more countries that do decide to go down that road, the closer we come to a more global conflict. And for what? Western powers refusing to hold Israel to account for committing a genocide, instead choosing to defend them over it and placing them on a pillar beyond all reproach. Such is the danger inherent of exceptions being made for any nation, like Israel has had made for it. Germany now seems set on implicating themselves as well, once more seemingly choosing the wrong side, because for some reason they think backing Israel, the Jewish state, given their history with the Jewish people, is what they have to do now. You aren't tainted by the sins of the past as long as people learn from it. Yet you're going down the wrong road here as if you haven't learned from it, and they're now backing the side committing genocide. The Nazi references against Hamas don't wash, and nor do claims of morality when so many civilians lie dead and are being killed still on a daily basis by Israeli forces. You have no claims to your war being just if a court rules against you and you claim to plan on ignoring them anyway. A new budget to keep the war going will be passed. I'm sure American citizens will be delighted to see their money once again being used for this. Though having told Blinken that Israel's war is now their war, there's no arguing that the US are up to their neck in trouble with their involvement here. In recent weeks, they've told Hamas and Hezbollah that every terrorist, wherever they are, is a dead man. Netanyahu said that. So is that a tacit admission to being responsible for the killing of Saleh al-Aruri in Beirut the other week? Kind of sounded like it. And then there was the threats to Iran too. Just keep picking more and more enemies around you, why don't you? It is becoming more and more obvious that regardless of the ruling the ICJ comes out with, and regardless of whether the UN votes to enforce it, nothing is actually going to change, and the whole situation in the Middle East is just becoming more and more unstable and dangerous. Netanyahu is off his rocker, and the US and UK, amongst others, are still choosing to stand with him, which is absolutely terrifying. And the leadership of both main parties in this country can't seem to agree to it fast enough. both seemingly intent on becoming complicit in all of this too, following the US unquestioningly as ever, as this video here will tell you all about. And I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so Keir Starmer and his rancid dishonesty, the man who can't lie straight in bed, lies like a rug, has a list of lies to his name longer than Mr. Tickle's arms, as after offering his assent to bombing Yemen last Friday, denied that counted as military action. That'll come as some comfort to the families of the dead Houthis from that inaction then. Accidentally walking into a paveway 4 missile, was it? Well, that was just careless of them, it would seem. So why make such a blatantly untrue statement about the UK's part in following Genocide Joe into battle against the Houthis in Yemen on Thursday night then? Well, what happens when a liar becomes unstuck by their own lies? They have to make a bigger lie up, don't they? That is exactly the position Starmer found himself in, and like all liars, he just kept on lying. But when your lies are contributing to genocide and mass loss of life, why the hell would you vote for such a person to run the country? Right, so Keir Starmer came unstuck this weekend, as his old lies caught up with him, and so he had to make up some new ones. And all of this was to excuse him as the leader of the UK opposition in not opposing the Tories yet again. Nothing new there, but on this occasion it was to back Sunak up by saying he agreed to support Sunak in joining in with the US attacking Yemen, because those blasted Houthis were a threat to Israeli shipping, and frankly there were no depths Biden won't sink to right now in order to keep supporting Israel, despite them having been halfway through their genocide case being presented at The Hague at the very time of this attack, brought against them by South Africa, of course. Now, Keir Starmer came unstuck on Laura Kuenssberg's show on Sunday, of all people to unstick him, over the matter of his support for military action against Yemen, because when you say stuff to camera in this day and age, well, it gets recorded, doesn't it? People keep the receipts, so to speak, and even stenographers like Kuenssberg are capable of pulling people up when that's the case, and the reason this has become such a moment of ridicule for Starmer goes back to when he first became Labour leader. We're still full of promises and pledges that he hadn't quite yet gotten round to breaking, and back in 2020 as this was, when he said, "I would pass legislation that said military action could be taken if first, the lawful case for it was made, secondly, there was a viable objective, and thirdly, you've got to get the consent of the Commons." A lawful case for military action, a viable objective, and Parliament having voted to give assent to such action. That was Keir Starmer's position in 2020. Therefore, by giving his personal support to joining the US attack on Yemen, he's failed on all 3 of his own points. Making a lawful case for this would be unlikely to stand up in court when Houthi actions are in order to force the end of a genocide. Very much against international law, as that happens to be, funnily enough. And a ruling from the International Court of Justice is expected on this soon. But how can it be unlawful to take action to end ethnic cleansing as the Houthis have? Surely they are upholding international law where the US and UK can be seen to be abusing it. There was no viable objective. It was hit 10 targets and leave, and all it has succeeded in doing is pissing the Houthis off, and they've now decided to place the same shipping sanctions on the UK that they placed on Israel already, screwing up global trade for us going forwards. How is that viable? And thirdly, Parliament has not yet voted on this. It almost certainly will by the time this goes out, but it hadn't done at time of writing, because both Sunak and Starmer will whip their MPs to do so retrospectively. But that isn't the point. Having been confronted by this footage by Laura Kuenssberg, how would Starmer, the warmongering worm, wriggle out of this one? Well, with more lies, of course. Let's dig the hole deeper. Kuenssberg put to him after that clip that it was one of your own solemn promises to your own party members that you would make it mandatory under a Prevention of Military Intervention Act that there would be the consent of Parliament. Have you changed your mind? Well, I would argue, given his track record 4 years on, that he never meant a word he said, because he never does. But he came back with a whopper. He said, "No, there's no inconsistency here. There's obviously a huge distinction between an operation, the like of which we've seen in the last few days, and military action. A sustained campaign, military action, usually involving troops on the ground. That's recognised by everybody. National security must come first. There will always be urgent situations where Parliament can't be consulted beforehand, but the principle that if there is to be a sustained campaign, if we're to deploy our troops on the ground, that Parliament should be informed, There should be a debate, and the case should be made, and there should be a vote. I do stand by that act in principle. Absolute liar. Smoke alarms should have been going off in that studio as your wife front spontaneously combusted. How dare you insult our intelligence like that? There's a difference between a military operation and a military action. Because there was no boots on the ground in Yemen, therefore it didn't count. The military was involved, so it was a military action. Calling it an operation doesn't change that. Planes went in, bombs were dropped, missiles were used, 10 Houthi targets were destroyed. It would have been more honest to say it was an economic action instead of a military one, considering it was all for the benefit of Israel's economy. Their precious shipping, which their economy relies on, along with billions in US cash. There will always be urgent situations where Parliament can't be consulted beforehand. Sure, I agree with that. However, this wasn't one of them. The only urgency was that the US said, we're bombing Yemen now, are you coming? And Sunak decided to ask you before he said yes, which he would have done anyway. This wasn't urgent. It wasn't a matter of national security either, since nobody forced us to put a warship in the Red Sea. If anything, national security has been damaged by this action, since our own economic security is now going to take a hit, as the Houthis will now target British shipping in the Red Sea as well. Due to our flipping the bird to the EU and trade with Europe, this will actually have even more of an impact than it would have had before Brexit, in fact. You haven't achieved anything. The Houthis will just carry on. And as for his Prevention and Military Intervention Act, he still had the brass neck to say he agreed with it. But look out for that byword, in principle. In other words, he will not commit to it. And where Starmer is concerned, you can expect it to never ever materialise. And definitely not in relation to Israel, Zionist without qualification as he is. And if you want to see how good Starmer is at not promising anything at all, here's a brilliant example putting it exactly how he avoids committing to anything.
Government. This is a sense of purpose-driven government, a mission that will, is a 5 or 10 year project. The mission, there were 5 of them. The one in relation to the Green Pledge.
We've just had GDP figures today, only monthly figures, but a slight improvement there.
Well,
of course, Starmer's devotion to military action, however he decides to describe it, he's been agitating for airstrikes in Yemen for the last week at least, as this video will tell you all about. You should definitely watch it next, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so having attacked Yemen for daring to hold Israel accountable by way of blockading their shipping, the UK now faces having its own shipping blockaded if it tries to pass through the Red Sea. The limited impact of the Houthis, little more than hardening their resolve, in effect, to stand by Palestine as pretty much all other nations on earth turn a blind eye, with honourable exceptions such as the South Africa legal case notwithstanding. But this stupid act, this delusion of imperial grandeur from this country will come at a price for us. When people in the UK have endured years of austerity, have seen the Tories' economic idiocy put ahead of what needed to be done during the pandemic, the fallout from that still being analysed and gone over, but also definitely led to soaring inflation and greedflation, costing us all more and more. And we're now witnessing the spectacle of both the Tories and Labour having spent millions on attacking Yemen, in lockstep with each other as they are, instead of helping the people of this country, and in the process have done something likely to lead to more price rises once again. Right, so if there's one thing all of us across whatever political divide you care to draw lines over can agree on right now, is that we're all sick of how expensive it is to get by right now. We've had austerity, thanks to the same unelected Foreign Secretary we've got now, David Cameron, from back when he was Prime Minister. We've had Brexit cause economic chaos as well. That was Dave's fault as well, but he ran away rather than dealing with that, didn't he? As all of a sudden tariffs need to be paid, don't they? Red tape is tying everything up, isn't it? And we all pay extra for that. The knock-on effects of the pandemic as well, and the stupidity of the government placing the economy before people's lives, costing people their lives as they broke the rules themselves. But having tried to open the country up before suppliers were prepared for it, consumption ended up outstripping supply and prices were driven through the roof. People had to pay it. There was a loathing on the part of suppliers across all manner of markets afterwards, from food to energy, to bring those prices down when they were able to. And the government again failed to help ordinary people by holding them to account on that. Such has been the depressing spectacle of the last more than a decade of life in the UK. So I'm sure we were all cheering Rishi Sunak handing a £2.5 billion package of our money to Volodymyr Zelensky in Ukraine last week, weren't we? Not. Just performative nonsense such as that we all end up having to pay for. Such is the case for having to spend billions more on a vanity show of military action against Yemen, taking off from an island whose people no longer want us there, in Cyprus, and achieving nothing except to piss off the Houthis directly with us, and meaning they'll now seek to block our shipping through the Red Sea too. Now, some commentators argue that the Houthis have been indiscriminate in what shipping they've stopped. That's the language of Western media, I fancy. I've not seen definitive proof of that, though have seen reports of shipping passing through the Red Sea completely untouched by them. So I'm unwilling to buy into that. But the question now needs asking, how badly is our trade now going to be screwed up, and at what cost to us? Because you know damn well this can only result in prices going up due to additional costs and likely supply issues. On a global scale, all trade from Asia, Australasia and East Africa comes through the Red Sea to get to us. So whatever goods you can think of that come from that way are now going to become more expensive. They're bound to. For example, in fuel costs alone, according to the Denmark-based shipping analyst Peter Sand, the cost of travelling around the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa, instead of nipping through the Suez Canal and through the Mediterranean, will add about £1 million just in additional fuel costs per ship. Those costs will get passed on to us at the tills. Food inflation in the UK, as a for instance, is still up on incomes, sitting at 6.7% on the latest figures. So still above what most of us got by way of a price rise or an income increase over 2023. That inflation level has dropped since November. But watch that swing into reverse if suppliers are unable to get goods or unwilling to risk trying to get goods to us via the Red Sea now. So what could we be looking at then, Damo? Well, look at the trade deals the Tories couldn't jump up and down about fast enough in their excitement to flip two fingers to the EU, and in order to sell a vision of economic panacea and a Brexit payoff for all of us, in favour of free trade deals they got sorted out just in the last year. Just look at the ones just in the last year. Last May, they were singing and dancing about trade deals they'd signed with Australia and New Zealand coming into force. Do you remember that one? Now, firstly, it was a rubbish deal, but boy, did they crow about it, didn't they? Of course it was a rubbish deal. It was negotiated by Liz Truss. For the sake of undercutting our own farmers over things like lamb from New Zealand and beer and tobacco being our main imports from Australia, we got a deal worth just 0.08% of GDP. That was the minuscule gain. But now add in that factor that none of those goods can come in via the Red Sea. That deal could actually now cost this country money. The other big trade deal was joining the CPTPP block of countries, wasn't it? Do you remember that one? The Kemi Badenoch flying out and gurning all over the TV, signing her trade deal. The Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. This block of countries was sold to us all by the Tories as an amazing deal. But actually it only added Malaysia and Bahrain as countries we already had to have free trade deals with. All the other countries in that group we already have free trade deals with, including New Zealand and Australia. And again, they're both on the wrong side of the Red Sea. So this minuscule gain to our economy might also get wiped out. But actually, these Tories' negotiation farces are the tip of the iceberg. How much more will everything cost that happens to have made in China stamped on it, for example? This coming Christmas is a long way off, except we're still in January. Could be hilarious, though, in a bad way, as there ends up being a horrendous shortage of toys. Last year, for example, we imported £67.5 billion worth of goods from China that could now have to travel all the way around Africa. £22.3 billion worth of goods came from India, £14.4 billion worth of goods from Japan, and the list goes on and on. Of course, it works the other way too, with exports. We export billions of pounds worth of goods every year through the Red Sea as well. That if we have to send it around Africa now, we'll drive costs up, and we'll probably end up selling less of it. How will that affect businesses here? We sold £41.3 billion worth of goods to China. As a national market, as a country in and of itself, it's the sixth biggest country that we export to. £20.2 billion worth of goods exported to Hong Kong, £16 billion to India, £13.7 billion to Australia. 9 of the 10 major shipping companies are avoiding the Red Sea already. Now tankers of oil and gas are going to do likewise. The only shipping that was previously affected was Israeli. Now all these goods bound for here or leaving here are screwed up too. Gas, oil and shipping rates are already rising again, and while still below the worst heights of last year, where so many of us needed help to cover our bills, could all go up again, and shops like Tesco are warning prices as well as choice of goods will end up being affected. Well, maybe we can see off all these Houthis then. Maybe if we keep on attacking them, we'll win and preserve our own economy after this act of rampant stupidity. No, we won't. For 7 years, the Saudis, amongst the wealthiest, most well-armed of Middle Eastern nations, have tried bombing the Houthis into oblivion. The so-called rebels, accounting for some 20,000 people, that's as many as there are, and they still failed. Every time their stuff gets hit, their gear gets destroyed, the Houthis are Iran-backers, because the media cannot stop reminding us, of course, that they are Iran-backed. Just keep restocking them. The Saudis, frankly, should be called Western-backed as much as Israel should be. But you can't win here. 20 years in Afghanistan taught the West nothing, it seems, on that score. A former US Army officer called Scott Bennett was asked on Russia Today about Western forces finally stepping up and hitting back after months of the Houthis. That's how Russia Today put it to him, targeting Israeli shipping. And he said, well, they may have stepped up and hit back, but this is a fight that they will inevitably lose. The Yemenis have been the heroic leaders of the people that have risen up and actually put muscle to where their mouth is. Turkey hasn't, Egypt and Jordan and other countries have not, but the Houthis have, and they've simply said, stop the genocide of the Palestinian people, stop the genocide of women and children, stop blowing up every inch of Gaza, and we'll let ships pass by. If you don't stop this genocide, we won't let a single ship that is bound for Israel or trades with Israel or exports or imports anything to or from Israel float. Now, I take issue with him saying float. The Houthis haven't sunk anything at this point, but I think his point is no less valid. And now what he was saying about the Houthis at the time of that interview about Israel now equally applies to us. Escalation in the region over this likely could and will lead to ships being sunk, though. And at the end of the day, it has to be said, for what? For the sake of allowing Israel to continue to commit genocide? How messed up is that? Just like suppliers couldn't react to the sudden change of lockdown getting lifted, the sudden action in the Red Sea that happened overnight on Thursday to no warning, that we all woke up on last Friday morning to news of, has meant a sudden shift in global trade to suppliers has happened again, that they cannot react fast enough. If and when prices of food and fuel rise again, linked directly to this, the blame sits squarely on Sunak and Starmer for jumping when America told them to. Of course, there might be even more to it than that. Not that that helps us out economically whatsoever. But there might be an altogether shadier reason for the UK's involvement in attacking Yemen as well, which if you watch this video here next, you'll find out all about. And I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so a wee while ago I did a video following up on all the pro-Palestine demonstrations happening in the constituency of Keir Starmer's most loyal minion, the Shadow Health Secretary Wes Streeting. Streeting is not only in lockstep with Starmer on everything, he's hell-bent on bringing even more privatisation into the NHS, as well as being a devoted member of Labour Friends of Israel. He's heavily backed by the Israel lobby and has ignored the uproar there has been locally in his constituency, Ilford North, and the area covered by Redbridge Borough Council, which Streeting's constituency falls under. In fact, it has been the Redbridge Community Action Group, so sick of Streeting's pro-Israel, pro-Starmer ways, that organised protests consisting of hundreds of Streeting's constituents outside his constituency office over his failure to call a ceasefire. But now they've organised so that they've got a candidate to stand against him, standing up not just for Ilford North, but as a British Palestinian woman, their chosen candidate, Leanne Mohamad, will also be standing up for the rights of Palestine. Right, so really bad news for Wes Streeting, which means good news story for this channel, and frankly, good news for the country, as a guy bought and paid for via donations linked to both the private health lobby and the Israel lobby is really not somebody you want anywhere near the levers of power. There's not somebody who will reverse the privatisation that has already been ruining our health service for more than a decade now, and indeed isn't even capable of calling for a ceasefire as Israel commits more and more genocide, such as his and the Labour Party under Keir Starmer as a whole, really, and their devotion to the Israeli state. No question ever as to whose side they are on, when they'd rather side with a nation committing genocide than call for it to stop, preferring things like humanitarian pauses or sustainable ceasefires that really aren't ceasefires at all. But it sounds good if you put the word sustainable in the front, doesn't it? It does sound a lot better if you use the word permanent instead, though. But Labour won't do that. Now, this is particularly foolish of Wes Streeting to do, because his constituency has a significant Muslim vote, and there's a big chunk of vote that he is in effect spurning. When the Muslim vote was formerly one Labour could take for granted, losing it can be costly to a number of Labour MPs. Streeting's just one of them. Starmer has now made this even worse by shifting Labour to a position of no longer backing the recognition of a Palestinian state. So he's very much being lent on by the Israel lobby right now, I would think. Choosing to announce that policy move here and now of all times shuns that Muslim vote even further. And actually, when you consider that this is a guy who regularly mixes Zionism with anti-Semitism, the fact he recognises and supports a Jewish state of Israel, but now has announced he won't do likewise for a Palestinian Muslim state, by his own measure, his announcement therefore can't be read any other way than as Islamophobic. But making things worse for Streeting still, that candidate selected at a hustings held last night by the Redbridge Community Action Group is a British Palestinian, making this contest not only about delivering for the people of Ilford North, an MP who actually bothers with them, but that actually they could have a choice here between two candidates where one stands with the oppressor and the other with the oppressed. It's also in the hands of Ilford North to make sure that the private health lobby's investment in Streeting turns out to be a poor one, by seeing him lose his seat and get him dumped out of Parliament too. Leanne Mohamad won the hustings last night, having been selected by more than 200 of the attendees. So this was a significant event. There was a lot of people there. Therefore, don't think for 1 minute she doesn't have a chance, because Streeting is so well known, always on TV. Surely, my goodness me, she can't possibly be able to topple this guy. Well, his majority is only 5,218. That's in a constituency of over 100,000 voters, and where Muslims make up more than 23% of the voting population. In fact, as I said in another recent video, because of boundary changes, things are even worse than that for Streeting going into the next general election, as a section of the even more Muslim Ilford South is being added to his constituency. Might only be a tiny bit, but considering that that constituency is more than 43% Muslim, it lends weight to a problem Starmer's Labour have made for themselves amongst Muslim voters and seem intent on doubling down on it, possibly because their intensive wooing of Tory voters is more important to them than the Muslim demographic. Well, that can hurt Labour in a number of seats, and that very much does include Mr Streeting, seemingly oblivious to this as he is by his actions, or just plain ignoring it, given there's been little sign of him making any kind of overt criticism of Israel or support for the plight of Palestinians. Well, now he will have to answer for that, because I'm fairly sure a lot of his constituents want an answer from him on his tone-deaf narrative on the Middle East situation right now, and it will very much be front and centre with the Palestinian opponent, quite happy to hold him to account on that, I am sure. Let's have a bit of a rundown of Streeting's antics concerning Israel and Palestine a moment, shall we? He's referred to the genocide case that South Africa have brought against Israel, in which South Africa are widely thought to be likely to win, with hopefully impending provisional orders which will lead to a ceasefire soon, as a distraction. 30,000 dead Palestinians and holding Israel to account is a distraction. What a charming chap. He claims to want a ceasefire, yet when one was brought to Parliament, he abstained on it. He was never off TV attacking Corbyn over anti-Semitism, yet can't bring himself to criticise Israel when cause to is now blatantly obvious. There are the donations linked to the Israel lobby. There is his membership of Labour Friends of Israel. He abstained on the boycott bill the other night, presumably because it would be an endorsement of BDS and that could be used against Israel. He called Corbyn and Farage two cheeks of the same backside. That must make him a wart on Tony Blair's unmentionables then. But saying that in connection to Starmer claiming that we've lost control of our borders, which is just Suella Braverman levels of nastiness. He met with a tech giant in Israel on a recent junket linked to the Israeli Defence Force, and then stood up and advocated for them as the future of the NHS, meaning not only is Streeting looking at bringing in more privatisation into our health service, but in all possibility and in all likelihood, Israeli firms at that. The list goes on and on. He is one of the most singularly dislikable MPs going, but as one chap at the hustings said, a local member called Mohammed Rahim Saeed, we have voted a Palestinian woman to take on Wes Streeting and Labour at the next election in Ilford North. A fitting choice to stand against the genocide supporters. I totally agree, and I can imagine there will be no shortage of people prepared to go out and campaign with Leanne to get her over the line here, because it really is doable. If you're local, get involved. Visit redbridgecommunity.org/get-involved to sign up and help out. It's not just boots on the doorsteps and leaflet stuffers needed. There are roles to suit everyone right now. In a general election where there's little hope of change coming should Labour win, which seems likely still, there are little rays of hope here and there that show that not necessarily everything is going to go Keir Starmer's way. It doesn't have to go his way. His sidekick Streeting is exceptionally vulnerable. There is no better candidate that could stand against him right now than a British Palestinian, a British Muslim, standing up for Ilford North and for Palestine. And if you watch this video here next, you can find out all about Streeting's plans for a pro-Israel NHS. See if that doesn't harden your resolve to get involved against him a bit more, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so Keir Starmer has dropped the idea of recognising Palestine as a state in its own right, has he? All that talk about wanting to see a two-state solution. His commitment to that about as nailed on as his 10 leadership pledges were, it seems. But when Starmer is avowedly committed to the existence and survival and the prosperity of Israel, of a Jewish state, as a Zionist without qualification, his own words implies, does that not make his refusal to recognise a Palestinian state now as Islamophobic? At least by his own measure it would, surely. Since being anti-Israel is, according to Zionists, anti-Semitic as well. Actually, what he has said is even worse than that, because he said he wouldn't recognise an independent Palestinian state unilaterally. Therefore, he would only recognise such a state in effect if Israel do. He's placed a condition on it. Well, what business is it of yours to do that then? Right, so this story of Keir Starmer having binned the idea of recognising a Palestinian state, you can imagine he didn't need leaning on very heavily by a donor or a lobbyist to come to this idea of abandoning the Corbyn-era pledge of recognition of a Palestinian state, because for one, it was Corbyn's idea, and therefore it has to be binned, because Starmer is still terrified of him. He's still living rent-free in his head, as bringing him up in a speech the other day proved. But equally, Israel has zero intention of ever allowing there to be a Palestinian state, and they've become increasingly more emboldened to outright say that. The UK ambassador for Israel, Zippy Ottaveli, now infamously saying as much in a TV interview the other week, that triggered a number of calls for her to be expelled from the country over it, but of course, she's still here. Now, this story, it does have to be said, despite having been picked up on social media and people running with it, has come from a notoriously untrustworthy news source in the Jewish Chronicle. But it's been out for some 24 hours now and nobody's refuted it, so well, maybe it's got some legs in this case. But then it is also the sort of story that will appeal to the JC, given it both bashes Corbyn and is pro-Israel. So what's Starmer apparently said then, Damo? Well, out goes Corbyn's pledge, which was to recognise a Palestinian state on day one of a Labour government, and instead in comes a two-state solution, inverted commas, at the right time in the peace process. Well, what peace process is that then? Because there isn't one, is there? No ceasefire can get past. Israel is committing genocide with impunity, and only South Africa have gone down the road of dragging them to court over that. A number of countries have now signed up in support of that, and kudos to them for that. Yemen have preferred to put muscle where their mouths are and blockaded Israeli shipping, of course, which has now led to the US and UK bombing Yemen. Because how dare they try and stop Israel's genocide of the other nation Starmer is apparently referring to in his idea of a two-state solution, where basically one nation has a say over whether the other becomes a state, and Israel are already saying no. I think that's where we're at. The entire Middle East is being destabilised, though, we do know this. And the one thing that makes sense to most people, the one thing that would diffuse it, the enforcement of a ceasefire, and Israel being told to get out of Gaza, is the one thing nobody will do. It's crazy. South Africa are now apparently going to take the US and the UK to the International Court of Justice for aiding and abetting in genocide, thanks to their bombing run in Yemen. And Starmer gave Sunak the nod to bomb Yemen, making him complicit too. So frankly, why should we care what Starmer has to say when, just like Rishi Sunak and Genocide Joe, they all belong behind bars now? Starmer really is a piece of work, isn't he? He's outdone Blair again, a blood-stained warmonger before he's got into power. Dead Houthis on his hands too. Israel will never recognise the state of Palestine. The state of Palestine existed before Israel did. I've got 2 family Bibles on a shelf that depict it. So it is a gross insult to say there cannot be a state of Palestine, or there isn't a state of Palestine, or that there is no state of Palestine, as Starmer's Middle East minister has said. A complete non-entity by the name of Wayne David. I had to look him up myself. He's the MP for He's been an MP for over 20 years. And he went straight over my head when I saw his name. I had to Google him. So really making his mark in Parliament, clearly. But anyway, he's the Middle East minister, or shadow minister for Starmer, and he said, "We will recognise the state of Palestine at a point which will help the peace process once negotiations between Israel and Palestine and the others are taking place. It's not about the Labour government going, right, we recognise Palestine. Big deal. We want to see a state of Palestine being established, but there is not a state of Palestine now." Well, here's a news flash for you, sunshine. Just because you and Keith won't recognise a state of Palestine, you might like to know that 72% of all UN member states do recognise a state of Palestine. So we here in the UK, or by we I say them, these non-entities in power, are in the minority. So get over yourselves. Palestine exists as a state. You might not like that. You might decide, well, I don't recognise you. Israel sure as hell don't either. But there it is. According to Wayne David, to just arbitrarily recognise Palestine as Corbyn wanted was T-shirt politics and would just antagonise people. Like who? Israel? Tough. Last year, David featured in an article on Welsh site Nation Cymru, which was entitled "Labour are not in the pockets of Israel, says Shadow Minister Wayne David." The article, from November last year, so only a couple of months ago, showed that 13 of the 31 members of Starmer's shadow cabinet have received funding from pro-Israel lobby sources. More than half are involved with Labour Friends of Israel, including Wayne David himself. So we've got T-shirt politics, a refusal to recognise Palestine without it being part of a peaceful resolution that nobody in the UK is calling for, and won't either until Genocide Joe decides to first. The US setting our foreign policy for us, in effect, but we knew that. And the opportunity to rub Corbyn's nose in things too, because, well, this sorry bunch of Starmeroids just hate him, don't they? But here's the thing. A 2-state solution can only ever work and only ever be viable if both states involved are involved on an equal footing. By making the statehood of one reliant on the viewpoint of the other, and especially when that other is genociding the former, there is no way a 2-state solution that will last and work going forwards can come about. It's favouritism. It is backing on one state over the other. And when that state, the state of Israel's existence, is predicated upon Zionism, which is a political doctrine, but one that strives to claim it is religious as well, when you bring religion into this, when arguments get made that to deny the state of Israel's existence is to be racist itself, is to be anti-Semitic, how then, in which case, can it not be true that denying Palestine recognition would therefore be Islamophobic? I prefer to take religion out of this equation, personally, myself. I don't think it helps. In fact, I know it doesn't. I think it has helped Israel be excused of its actions for too many years. I think the religious aspect should be set aside. But in my view, if you invoke anti-Semitism when Israel gets criticised, if you don't therefore recognise Palestine too, you are, by your own measure, your own definition, as somebody calling for a 2-state solution, Islamophobic. How can that not be the case? Does that not make Zionism as a political doctrine also a racist doctrine, when adherents to it talk of taking over Gaza and driving out the Palestinian people, of relocating them, as we have heard many pro-Israeli voices say? Starmer placing conditions on Palestinian statehood that he would never see put on Israel, and being a Zionist as he is, it's very difficult to see how he can avoid inviting accusations of being a racist in this there. A man who has gone to such lengths to say Labour is fixed and he's dealt with anti-Semitism, in his opinion anyway, but in fact he's just let other forms of racism like Islamophobia pervade. In fact, he seems to have had a hand in helping that by his words and deeds regarding Israel and Palestine. And policy moves like this are just rubber stamping that, are they not? When he's actually purged more Jewish people than any other Labour leader, it's a farce he claims to have dealt with anti-Semitism in any way, shape or form, in fact. Labour is just a narrow-minded, nasty party, more racist, not less, and still living in fear of the socialism it is supposed to stand for. A hierarchy of racism, it's been called, of course. It's been exposed again and again. And if you watch this video here next, you'll find that even the Bernie Grant leadership programme encouraging more black leaders to come forward in the Labour Party isn't immune from it. And I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so the Nasser Hospital in southern Gaza, which is the largest still functioning medical facility in the whole of Gaza, is in the line of fire right now as Israel claim, as always, that Hamas are using the facility as a base of operations. Their broken record of an excuse to justify their bombing of civilian targets continues. We've been so saturated with the sheer scale of atrocity that I fear there's a certain amount of anaesthetising to the scale of the devastation going on in Gaza still when we hear about it. And what I mean by that is that when October 7th came around, we started to see social media filled with videos and stories of hospitals and churches being hit. We were up in arms. We were incredulous. We were unbelieving that this was intentional by Israel. And yet here we are now. Gaza's healthcare system all but wiped out, medical aid being held up, being denied access to Gaza, accusations of Hamas stealing it even. Well, there's also being documented evidence of anaesthetics being taken out of kits by Israelis so that operations are being conducted in Gaza without it. Amputations without anaesthetic, sometimes on kids. Can you imagine that? And that's been intentionally engineered. And so now, when I talk of being anaesthetised ourselves to what is happening, we are no less shocked, but we're also no longer surprised by it. Surprise has turned to anger and disgust at the state of Israel and all of those supporting them. Of the fact the media is failing utterly in its reportage of this. And when it comes to Nasser Hospital, most of what we know right now that happened last night there is via an Instagram feed from a media commentator in the hospital, fully dressed in press livery as she was, reporting on the situation she's caught up in that she said on film she didn't expect to survive. That takes some guts. Right, so the Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis in the south of Gaza, where of course the Israeli government and the Israeli Defense Force have directed Gazan citizens to go when they pushed them out of the north, for their own safety, they said, before subsequently turning their attention on them anyway, militarily, because Hamas, that word less a description of Gazan resistance and more a symbol of Israeli excuses. And despite the atrocity committed by Hamas on October 7th, I have no problem describing the Hamas excuse of Israel as such, as an excuse, because their response to that day has been so blatantly disproportionate. Nasser Hospital is basically the last line of healthcare in the whole of Gaza now. If Israel want to rapidly increase the rate at which innocent Gazans suffer and die, then rendering Nasser inoperable would basically do it. It's against international law for Israel to do this, to target civilian infrastructure like hospitals. Yet it has gone on with impunity, now to the point there may not be a healthcare system left there. Overnight tanks have closed in on Nasser amidst massive airstrikes. As we've seen in the past, people gather at the hospitals to seek shelter from this, even though the hospital itself always seems to end up a target too. This, I reiterate, was supposed to be a safe area Israel directed the people of Gaza to go when they forcibly moved them. A war crime in itself, of course, from the north of Gaza. Now the war crime is compounded further with no safe places for the people of Gaza to go. It is another crime scene. And of course the US, the UK and the EU are all complicit because of their ongoing support for Netanyahu's genocidal insanity. But you don't have to take my word for what is happening in Nasser, because Palestinian filmmaker Bisan Auda is currently trapped in Nasser Hospital. There was a filmmaker, she's been reduced to having to use her mobile phone, as so many of us do just to make average videos, but hers is so much more important because hers is literally the information we're getting out of this area right now. It's all she's got anymore since her family's home and office and all of her equipment were bombed and destroyed as part of the IDF carpet bombing, laying waste to Gaza City in the north. In what she admitted might be her final film, as she was fully expecting not to survive the night, she said, "This is Bisan from Gaza. I'm still alive. I'm surviving after the day 3 after 100, but that might be the last day for the last night in Nasser Medical Complex, as the hospital is new to the invasion. The tanks are maybe 40 to 50 metres away from us. The soldiers as well. So the situation is really hard. The carpet bombing before this moment was just unbelievable. The bombings are really loud and so close to us. The situation is complicated. I'm trying to find any internet connection to tell you what is happening. What Nasser medical complex is now near to be invaded. It's the last functioning hospital. I'm trying to find any connection so I can tell you what is happening. The carpet bombing. The ambulances could not even reach the entries, or the people were killed and injured because of the carpet bombing in the area. The west and the south of a refugee camp. The people who are displaced inside the hospital. Dozens of thousands are just moving randomly. Cannot find any place to go. They tried to go to the schools around the hospital, or even to the refugee camp itself to find a safe place while the carpet bombings and the bombings continued and were ongoing during their evacuating. So it was and still is so dangerous for people, the medical staff, the ambulances. Many people also evacuated the hospital. That's so dangerous. This is the last functioning hospital in Gaza. That means that thousands of injuries are still now alone in the hospital. This place, people are alone in the hospital. They are besieged. We are besieged. I don't know if I can survive this or go anywhere. I'm just alone. Alone as thousands, alone as many in other hospitals were before. In Al-Shifa hospital and the Indonesian hospital. It's a war against hospitals, against children, against women, against people, disabilities and injuries. People are just dying. I'm now talking to you in a risky place, in a dangerous place. Just watching everything and hearing everything by my ears and by my eyes to not tell you anything. It's not true. It's true. They are invading the hospital. I'm trying now to upload this, to leave the phone uploading this and just to get away from here. If I could get back to the phone and see if it's published, I will. If I couldn't, then this should be my last video. I'm still alive, but I don't know if I'm surviving this night. It's now 12:32 a.m, 17th of January, 2024. Salam. At time of writing, we've no idea what has become of Bisan. Hopefully she will post again soon, or news will come out that she is safe. A more sinister reason for the targeting of Nasser Hospital has been postulated, though, than Israel's wolf cry of Hamas being the reason. And that is that a deal was recently brokered by Qatar and France to get medicine delivered to Gaza in exchange for Israeli hostages. It would hardly be in Hamas's interest to agree to such a deal and then, by their own presence, make the last functional hospital in Gaza a target. What use is medicine with nowhere to use it and nobody trained to administer it? But who would put it past Israel? We already know how little they value hostages with their Hannibal directives and their indiscriminate bombing and shooting, which has seen the IDF kill their own people being held hostage by Hamas. This morning, the Nasser hospital is still standing, but a nearby cemetery has been destroyed and the IDF have allegedly stolen corpses. The claim they are making on this appears to be that they suspect the bodies to be those of Israeli hostages that have been killed by Hamas. I'd love to know how they could possibly know that, in the dark, when the cemetery got bombed as well, that they had exactly the right place to look for them. They got exactly the right bodies. But I wouldn't bet against them coming back shortly with an announcement that they were indeed Israeli hostages and they'd been murdered in some horrible manner by Hamas in order to justify further attacks and likely take Nasser Hospital out completely, which is next door. I just have zero faith in anything coming from Israeli sources. Too much of what they've said has been readily debunked. For heaven's sake, South Africa put together an 84-page court submission to the International Court of Justice, spelling all of this out. But that wasn't even the half of it, as testimonies from Israel's own people have completely shredded any integrity that the authorities might have been in possession of, as this video here will tell you, which you should definitely watch next, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Think of Bisan. Cheers, folks. Right, so those Iran-backed Houthis in Yemen, did you know they were Iran-backed, by the way? I don't think our media mentions it nearly enough, do they? Well, it's such a nuisance to global shipping, cough cough, Israel's shipping and economy, cough cough, that the US and UK went ahead and bombed them back in defence of the genocide. How dare Yemen try and impose sanctions to stop Israel killing civilians in Gaza, such as the madness of Western intervention. But of course all this has done is get the backs up of those Iranian backers. One of the most powerful nations in the Middle East, an Arab nation, appalled at what Israel is doing in Gaza, and not by any means letting the fact Israel are very much Western-backed pass them by, even if our media choose to repeatedly not say that when covering the ongoing situation in the Middle East. It's also not going to go down any better by way of Genocide Joe redesignating the Houthis as a terrorist organisation, because People already do not see them as such because of their actions and what's driving them, and also because it was Biden that lifted that designation from the Houthis only back in 2021. So Iran have decided to send the West a message now, both in words and in deeds. Right, so the attack on the Houthis in Yemen was never going to be ignored by their backers in Iran. Those same backers make ongoing attacks against Yemen pointless, because for as long as Iran keep funding and supplying the Houthis, they will keep on fighting, because backing down just isn't in their nature. The futility of everything the West is doing in the Middle East right now, attacking Yemen and still supporting Israel to the bitter end, makes the entire situation all the more ridiculous when Israel ending its siege of Gaza will mean the Houthis stop their attacks on shipping as well. But no. By attacking Yemen, US and UK shipping is now a target, and it has meant Iran has become more involved itself. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard have launched attacks on sites in Iraq and Syria, which they have claimed to be linked to the Israeli intelligence agency Mossad. Iraq have kicked off about this, as you imagine they might. They have complained the missile strike by Iran hit civilian areas, and I can totally believe that, because Israel loves situating their military and intelligence assets amongst civilian areas. The headquarters of the IDF is in a civilian area of Tel Aviv, after all. Now, critics of this move, I'm certainly not ever going to advocate for escalating military action, as it certainly does, have argued that this is typical of Iran, that they always target other countries around Israel as a way of threatening Israel, targeting assets it has outside of its borders, rather than take on Israel itself. But the thing with escalating violence is until and unless ceasefire and peace talks come, it will just keep on escalating. 2 world wars proved that point. There's no end until somebody finally says enough, and hopefully that will happen following a court order in favour of that coming from the ICJ very soon, siding with South Africa in their genocide case against Israel, a case Iran is supporting South Africa in, as it happens. But of course that was before the US and the UK attacked Yemen. So Iranian retaliation, regardless of who it is aimed at, is a consequence of that. It certainly can be seen as that. And that got underlined by the warning Iran sent to the US verbally 2 days ago, courtesy of their Foreign Minister Hossein Amir-Abdollahian, a chap who got given short shrift by David Cameron recently, as covered in another one of my recent videos. I'm sure he was absolutely aghast and terrified by the fact. But he issued a statement mainly aimed at Genocide Joe, saying, "The Islamic Republic of Iran strongly supports the security of shipping and maritime navigation in the region. We warn America and England to stop the war against Yemen immediately. And we also warn America and the regime of Israel to stop the war against Gaza and the genocide against Gaza. The solution will never come through military actions. We told you that you should not stain your hands with the blood of innocent people in Gaza. Do not tie your fate to Netanyahu's destiny. America cannot stand with Israel with all its power and participate in the killing of 24,000 civilians in Gaza, including thousands of women and more than 12,000 children, and then at the same time tell others to exercise restraint, silence, and non-action. The White House should not tie the interests and national resources of America to this Israel's government and to the apartheid regime and occupation." In other words, follow your own advice and tell your spoilt brat of an Israel project to exercise restraint before telling others to do likewise. Now, the Iranian claim that solutions will never come about via military action is correct. I totally agree with that. However, subsequently firing missiles into Syria and Iraq is also making them hypocrites somewhat. Nobody here is calling Iran angelic by any stretch. They're also attacking Pakistan at the moment, targeting a group they happen to have designated terrorists, much like the US is doing with the Houthis. But they're a big player in the Middle East, and the US and UK are on the wrong side of them where it comes to Yemen and to Israel. On that point, though, I did note that the Foreign Minister referred to England and not the UK, which told me, well, this is how I read it anyway, told me that they are nobody's fools, and they know exactly which bit of the United Kingdom are the ones instigating this military intervention against the Houthis with the US, although most people in the UK are dead set against this, not just those in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. We keep electing leaders who choose to rule us instead of serve us and listen to us, and this really has got to end, because it's so tiresome now that they do nothing for us here or abroad. But Iran's own missile strikes aside, they are no less right in saying the US cannot call for de-escalation when they made themselves complicit in the killing of so many innocent people. Far, far more innocent civilians than have died in Iran strikes. So, of course, every fatality is a sad one and an unfortunate one, because they are always avoidable if dialogue can be opened first. So far as we know, nobody is pushing that still. In fact, the US, by use of its Security Council veto, has consistently blocked that. So they are already complicit and tied to Netanyahu's destiny, whatever you think that might mean. At the very least, it means him ending up behind bars. Iran have not directly hit Israel, but the Iraq target of Erbil is almost exactly the same distance from the source of that missile strike as Tel Aviv is. And I doubt that little fact has been lost on Israel, especially since multiple people on social media have been pointing this out. Of course, Israel is a nuclear power, though. Maybe that makes the difference. Maybe this is why Iran won't attack Israel directly. And Netanyahu, in his recent absolutely stark, raving, bonkers speech of the other day, said of a conversation he'd had with Secretary of State Antony Blinken that preventing Iran becoming a nuclear nation was imperative. Clearly, the idea of them getting nuclear weapons is, well, upsetting them a little bit. Arguably, it's why Iran doesn't strike Israel directly, as I just said. Arguably, it is why they choose to arm the Houthis instead. Get them to do their dirty work, so to speak. There's a lot of conjecture here, though. It's actually quite hard to disseminate exactly what the truth is, given what gets reputedly said by this state actor or another, because the waters get so muddied by media outlets biased one way or the other. But we try to muddle through and dissect it as best we can. What we can say with certainty, though, is that the longer Israel get away with carrying on in Gaza, the more nations in the Middle East are getting dragged into this. How much further is that going to spread? Well, if it carries on escalating, it will carry on escalating, won't it? More and more countries will end up getting dragged into this one way or another. We need a ceasefire. We need it ASAP before more countries get dragged into this. That de-escalation cannot come, I don't think, whilst Netanyahu is still in power. He'll never back down. He'll never stop. Not going by how insane that speech of his the other day was. It was mad. And I covered it in this video here, which you should definitely watch next if you're so inclined. And I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so how many of you still have an NHS dentist, I wonder? Any of you? Well, how do you fancy that being the future for seeing a doctor or a GP? Well, it just got passed into law and you probably didn't hear a damn thing about it. Oh, and if you're hoping a future Labour government will reverse this change, then forget it, because Sir Abstains-a-lot, Keir Starmer, had his party sit on their hands once again and let this pass. We know there's a chronic shortage of doctors and other health professionals. We know it takes years to train them, and yet the Tories have said they can pretty much magic them up and solve the problem. But their solving the problem is to inflict medically untrained people into the role doctors were doing. And this is so incredibly dangerous, for such obvious reasons, that the fact it is going barely reported at all is a travesty. But considering the solutions all involve someone making money as well, this should be seen for what it is, and called for what it is. The role of the doctor is being scrapped to suit big business, and certainly not to provide us with an operational NHS that's actually staffed by medically trained professionals. Right, so what's happened here then, Damo? Well, what we have here is the exposure of the Tories' master plan to solve the doctors' crisis while still selling the NHS off to vested interests by creating new roles for medically untrained people. But they're going to make you think they're doctors, even though they aren't. What the Tories have just done is give oversight to their newly created roles of PAs and AAs, nothing to do with personal assistants or Alcoholics Anonymous. They are actually competent and useful. But in this case, the abbreviations stand for Physician's Associate and Anaesthetist Associate. You can basically think of them as fake doctors and fake anaesthetists. So would you want to see one of those if you were admitted to hospital? There are also nursing associates out there too. The word associate will soon become synonymous with not trained. These roles are already in existence, have been for a little while now, not that long. But to make you think they are legitimate, oversight for them via backdoor legislation has been foisted onto the General Medical Council, the GMC, as far as their registration goes. The GMC is there for fully trained doctors only, supposedly, not for non-medical staff. But by legislating otherwise, the Tories are pulling a fast one. The roles have only recently come into existence. This latest move is more about fooling the general public into thinking they'll be seeing someone medically trained when they aren't. But already there have been at least two deaths, linked to PAs, one where an embolism got mistakenly diagnosed as a calf strain, and another where a serious heart condition got put down to being a panic attack. There will be more deaths to follow, and this is intentional. is unavoidable as well, because when we need more doctors, when we know there is a shortage, when many are retiring, the training still isn't happening. And also the training can't be rushed either. In the case of GPs, 6,000 properly medically trained doctors were held back from taking such roles so that PAs could fill them instead, who are cheaper. Above all else, they're going to be cheaper. They are part of the government, or what the government's calling their long-term workforce plan, which, to nobody's surprise whatsoever, Labour's weasel of a health secretary and Starmer's sidekick Wes Streeting is also in favour, and Labour would no doubt therefore retain. Together with a smaller, separate surgical role, they form what are called Medical Allied Professionals, or MAPs. Frankly, they can call them whatever they like. If they aren't calling them a doctor, then they aren't a doctor. Where a doctor will go through 5 to 6 years of training, these MAPs, these PAs and AAs go through 2 years of training. Where they go through a period of 12 to 24 months with a high level of supervision from a doctor, after that they become largely autonomous, with the caveat they are still overseen by a senior doctor. More work, therefore, for what few doctors there are left, for the doctors you would think. The reality is, more likely, just wouldn't happen because they wouldn't be able to make time for that. The registration with the GMC is something of a fudge too. As I said before, by registering with them, it gives the impression that these are medically trained, qualified and competent doctors, when they're not doctors at all. A first-year doctor cannot, for example, register with the GMC because they still aren't trained highly enough. But allowing MAPs to be registered and therefore regulated, in name only or in practice, remains to be seen. But it gives the impression they are medically trained when they are not to the level required, not even close. As a result of not being regulated at all, they become involved in some utterly unsuitable procedures up until now as well. An example given by Doctors Association co-chair Dr. Matt Neal, he spoke of PAs being involved in neurosurgery, brain surgery, with some PAs having said they are learning about anatomy on the job. It's not a building site. These are lives, people's lives. Doctors go through the years and years of training they do because theirs is one of the toughest and most complex professions there is. You don't learn as you go. You don't learn by trial and error. Not when it comes to the difference between life and death, as they deal with every day. So where does big business come into this then, Damo? Well, I'm sure you've all heard of NHS England by now, haven't you? How many of you think it's the NHS in England? That it is literally the NHS? Well, if you do think that, then I've got news for you, because actually NHS England is not the NHS at all, but a government quango. A body that the government has just devolved powers to, and in 2014, going back 10 years here, the former Vice President of United Health, a US private healthcare and health insurance company, everything we don't want involved in our NHS, isn't it, took over NHS England. Now, this was a guy who had been a health advisor to Tony Blair previously. All the cuts and the health reforms that New Labour oversaw, that government oversaw, that was just the start. By ending up in charge of NHS England, a cheerleader for health privatisation ended up with more power over our health service than any cabinet minister has. You've got to bear in mind, this is just 2 years after the Lansley health reforms came in, which just ramped up the opportunism for private health interests. Big business as that is. United Health has a turnover of some $324 billion annually, so you can understand the appeal an untapped market would be to a healthcare giant that our NHS represents to such people. Lansley's reforms threw the door wide open, and NHS England had a health privatiser in charge of them. Wonderful. That was 2014, like I said. That's 10 years ago now. And our NHS has been systematically, bit by bit, destroyed. And now we can't even have fully trained doctors to treat us, we're being told. Or rather, not told. We're being tricked into thinking. The takeover of NHS England by private health interests has seen US healthcare creep in more and more. The NHS itself has been butchered, with the most profitable bits tendered out to private health interests to make profit out of. And when you introduce a profit margin to our healthcare, that's money that would otherwise have gone into the healthcare, that instead now goes to line the pockets of the CEOs and their like, creaming cash off the top for delivering poorer services, with bigger backlogs, with fewer staff, particularly trained staff. Our NHS has gone from serving everyone for their every health need free at point of service to becoming a construct where cuts, closures and privatisation have become incentivised instead. There's been hell up, of course. Doctors have kicked off, gone on strike, demanded the privatisation must be reversed. We've seen years of this, haven't we? So, of course, the government needed to do some damage limitation in the intervening years. And if you've heard of the term ICS, or Integrated Care System, mentioned on the news, that is basically their fix. But it's a fix to the narrative. It's a fudge again, not to the health service itself. A harmless bureaucratic fix to the 2012 Health and Social Care Act that Andrew Lansley got wrong. Oh, he made a mistake. We'll just patch it up with this. We'll bring the health and social care bodies together. That'll save money. They'll better liaise with each other. The NHS will have never had it so good, they said. Well, this was a lie as well. ICSs are designed to once again make money for cuts, closures and privatisation. Nothing's actually changed. A reward system in effect for the budget holders is all it is. If they manage to spend less money, well, they get to pocket more of it. NHS England is the mask behind which all anti-NHS policies are hidden. Our health service is being destroyed, and people are being blinded to the fact by mainstream media selling this ongoing privatisation as if it's a fix. If they even talk about it at all, of course. Scrapping doctors now in favour of PAs and AAs is a symptom of this infection pervading our NHS getting worse. If we're to avoid the decline of our NHS becoming terminal, we need to stop voting people in who won't reverse this, won't restore it to the fully renationalised and redistributed health service brought in by Nye Bevan. The Green Party's committed to repealing the 2022 Act, which legalised ICSs, which is far more than any other party's discussing. But that still doesn't go far enough, and I say that as a Green myself. I want to hear them talking more about abolishing the ICS-led policies that are continuing the privatisation. Unless this gets dealt with, waiting lists are going to keep going up. More and more doctors, the real ones, will be driven away or done away with completely in favour of cheaper knockoff versions that we'll be told are just as good. Opportunities for them are already being reduced in favour of cheaper options, renaming them as they go to make them look like doctors, and all of our health will suffer going forwards. If people don't start objecting to this and actually fighting, then we'll end up with the NHS that we all do actually deserve, which is one that doesn't work, is ready to be abolished and replaced with one we mostly won't be able to afford. Forewarned is forearmed, folks. Consider yourself warned. And with West Streeting already describing the NHS as unsustainable, Labour sure as heck isn't going to fix things when the Tories leave, if it seems likely they return to power at the next general election, as this video here will explain all about. More austerity for the NHS from Labour. You might want to check it out, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so there are two goals, according to Israel, in their ongoing genocide of Gaza: dismantling the capabilities of Hamas and rescue their hostages. Benjamin Netanyahu has basically chosen taking out Hamas over the rescue of Israeli hostages still held by Hamas, because news has emerged that he's scuppered a hostage deal for his own ends. It's not gone down well, given his coalition government that is keeping him in power doesn't just consist of hard-right fanatics who want Gaza for themselves and the Palestinians cast out, but also has more moderate elements appalled that the hostages are apparently of less value to Netanyahu than dealing with Hamas is. Of course, what has made matters even more sticky for Netanyahu is that he did all of this behind his own cabinet's back too. Right, so Benjamin Netanyahu is right now managing to upset absolutely everyone he can't afford to in his insane pursuit of Hamas, which by his own actions, deeds more than words of course, actions always speak louder after all, as that now appears to supersede the rescue of the hostages that were taken by Hamas, which the people of Israel rightly want prioritised. Their safety and well-being should be foremost in the minds of people who purport to be civilised, and as much as you or I might balk at the use of that word in association with someone like Benjamin Netanyahu, he still sees himself that way. But he's not done that, or at least depends on which media outlet you look at covering this story as to what exactly he's done here. Classic case of different media outlets with different political leanings portraying the same story in slightly different ways. It's not worth bothering with the British media here, as, well, it would normally make a good example for such things, because they've ignored this story completely. But the Jerusalem Post, which is a right-wing Israeli paper, has claimed Netanyahu has delayed a new Gaza hostage deal. Haaretz, another Israeli paper, liberal, the leaning that it's mainly known for, was recently threatened with closure because it had consistently held Netanyahu to account for so much of his dealings. Really doesn't like Netanyahu. They've said that the hostage deal is taking a back seat because of Netanyahu's calculations, and the Turkish outlet Anadolu Agency have gone with Netanyahu rejects a hostage deal. Though in their case they claim to be repeating what has been said by Israeli media outlet Channel 13. Such is the wonderful world of media headlines, but once you dig in, you find the bits that all three outlets have in common, what they are all saying in their own way, and Ultimately, it spells trouble for Netanyahu if his calculations here, hostages being used as pawns in his own machinations, doesn't pay off. The crux of the matter is that there were plans for a new round of hostage release negotiations laid out. They had been agreed by Netanyahu's coalition government, his war cabinet, and then Netanyahu decided all by himself to delay or backtrack or scrap, depending on which paper you read and how you choose to look at it. Ultimately, it all amounts to the same thing, though, in that he has taken a unilateral decision without consulting his ragtag, cobbled-together coalition to leave Israeli hostages where they are. No leader should think like that about their own people. A first duty of any government, you would think, is to its own people. But not in Israel, it isn't. The first duty of government is whatever Netanyahu wishes and whatever Netanyahu thinks is best for himself. Why has he done this, then? He's thinking of himself. The trouble he's got is that he's gone into coalition with the far right, the likes of Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir, for whom only claiming Gaza for themselves will do. Yet he's also had to do a deal to keep more moderate voices happy, especially since October 7th. This is mainly when this latest line of action has come in. These newcomers into the coalition, the likes of Benny Gantz and Gadi Eisenkot from the National Unity Party. Keeping both wings of his coalition happy is basically impossible. In theory, a war perpetrated against Israel by Hamas should unite his side. That is why the National Unity Party came into the coalition. That argument that the entire events of October 7th, though, having been engineered or allowed to happen, could be, if ever proven, to have been committed by Israel, if that is true, as some people are talking about and has been a topic of discussion, be argued to have been to do that. If that ever does get proven, a genocide where some 30,000 people are dead, including 12,000 children, will have been all about keeping Netanyahu in power, at which point their lives the price he was willing to pay for power. But that'll be for investigators further down the line to prove, I dare say. Nonetheless, his thinking that unity would pervade in the face of war, no matter which wing of the political spectrum politicians in Israel came from, doesn't appear to be as solid as he might have thought, and cracks are appearing. The National Unity Party joined Netanyahu's coalition late in the day. Like I said, this Israeli coalition, his coalition government, had been in place since the 29th of December 2022. But National Unity didn't join until last October, just days after the Hamas attack, in order to form a government of national unity. So we've only actually been coalition partners of Netanyahu for the last 4 months during this latest increase in the situation, the crisis going on in Gaza, the genocide in Gaza. And things are looking strained already. Why should we be surprised? Did they think they were going to get into power with a reasonable man here? Netanyahu's only priority is himself. And remaining in charge of the National Unity Party of Gantz and Eisenkot, they thought they were doing the right thing. Well, this latest situation concerning their own people being held hostage by Hamas and their leader deciding to leave them there, having not consulted them on this change of plan, well, that is going to strain relations, isn't it? That's pretty obvious, you would think. Now, if National Unity walked away from Netanyahu's coalition over this, it wouldn't really change anything. It wouldn't trigger another set of general elections. Netanyahu would still have a coalition he can run the country on. They came into the coalition late, as I said, after all. But the optics, well, they wouldn't be great, would they? Part of the reason Gantz came in was to counterbalance how far right Netanyahu's coalition was. But given he and Eisenkot formed part of that war cabinet that was not consulted, that the conditions for a hostage deal were conducted with them, amongst others, and Netanyahu has kicked them all in the teeth over this by unilaterally tearing it up, as well as abandoning the hostages, well, I would be rather teasy. At the moment, Netanyahu is being accused of nothing more than missing an opportunity to get hostages released. You would think that some positive press that would bring from getting some more hostages released would be welcome to him. But it seems not. The opposition in Israel have called him incompetent. Frankly, that's being a bit polite, I think. So what's the deal that all of a sudden Netanyahu has decided to object to? What was in it? What did he find so offensive in the end that he agreed to it once and then decided, no, I can't do this? Well, it meant a ceasefire for one thing, a prolonged one, along with a massive release of Palestinian prisoners. You know, all the hostages Israel is holding, because nobody ever talks about them, do they? Gantz and Eisenkot backed that. God knows most of the planet backs that. But not Netanyahu. It didn't last more than a couple of days. He wants this war to go on into 2025 now, apparently, all in a bid to keep himself in power and his coalition partners on the far right happy, because without them his government will collapse, and because they want an end to any notion of a viable Palestinian state. If the presence of national unity in Netanyahu's coalition isn't achieving an end to this, their place on that side of the table is pretty much redundant, isn't it? So we'll have to see if they budge on this or not, decide to pack their bags and walk. They feel their hostages are owed a moral debt, but it's not one Bibi appears to be prepared to pay. Aside from the politics, Netanyahu is also pissing off the boots on the ground as well. The IDF and Shin Bet security forces aren't happy with him either. Their commanders want to know what the plan is for a post-war Gaza, but Netanyahu is not looking for an end at all at the moment. He has nothing to tell them, therefore. The military don't want to be going around in circles, clearing areas they've already dealt with, only to have to do so again, because they're failing to root out Hamas completely, always managing to evade the IDF as they are. And the US, via Israel devotee Antony Blinken, has said as much to Netanyahu as well now. They can't win this through warfare. You need to try something different. Yeah, you're missing the point as well, though, aren't you? All of this is about Netanyahu staying in power first and foremost. Everything else, literally everything else, is secondary. But let's talk about the US a bit more while we brought Blinken up. Genocide Joe is still supporting Israel, even though apparently he and Netanyahu haven't spoken for weeks now. Netanyahu doesn't like Biden despite everything the US is doing for Israel, and Haaretz allege that Netanyahu wants to keep things that way, so that despite all the support America has provided, Netanyahu can blame Biden for failing to achieve their goals in the hope Donald Trump returns to power in November, who Netanyahu is much keener on. I cannot imagine why. On top of all of that, of course, there's Iran, there's Libya, Lebanon, there's Syria, and Yemen, all banging on Israel's door right now. There's probably some more there that I've forgotten off the top of my head. Other war fronts that Netanyahu could exploit for his own ends, possibly, if he decides to calm things down in Gaza in the near future. But either way, this is a political leader who is clearly prepared to abandon his own people for the sake of himself. There can be no peace whilst he's still in post and war in Gaza rumbles on, as the IDF recently detonated the last standing university in Gaza, because nothing quite says genocide like wiping out educational infrastructure, does it? But they're hammering on the door of the last functional hospital there now too, as the Instagram filmmaker Bisan Alda has been documenting with her own life on the line in the process, which you can hear all about in this video here, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so Keir Starmer's Labour. Despite headline polling figures implying he's on course for a record-breaking supermajority, all very much despite the fact he is about as personally popular amongst the general public as a bag of cement gone hard, is, behind the scenes, still losing councillors and still losing council by-elections that follow. One in particular should cause Labour real cause for concern, because council by-election in one of the safest Labour constituencies in the country just went to the Tories by a landslide, and there's no ignoring the fact that amongst all the factors involved, the large Muslim and Jewish population resident in this area evidently walked away from Labour. People often say you can't compare local election and general election voting intention and results, but religious divides tend to supersede that thinking. If people of a certain faith feel you're against them or doing them a disservice, they won't vote for you full stop. How badly could this picture be replicated around the country towards Keir Starmer and his position on Israel and Gaza if he's losing seats like this one? Right, so, okay, this is a council by-election result, but it has been awful for Labour as a massive swing to the Tories has seen it lost. And there's no ignoring the potential impact the large Muslim and Jewish demographic here could have had in this result. We're in Hackney Borough Council, and Cazenove Ward, which lies in the constituency of Hackney North and Stoke Newington, the constituency of Diane Abbott. Now, Abbott is an MP who suffers an enormous amount of abuse, but her seat is safe as houses. She has a majority of more than 33,000. It is solid Labour territory, and yet still Starmer has overseen a loss here. Abbott, as many will know, was suspended from the party over a poorly worded article that was put out in a newspaper. As a clearly popular local MP, as the first female black MP ever, her place in history is assured. You can imagine such a well-known and high-profile Labour MP being suspended on pretty weak charges. She submitted the wrong draft of a letter, hurriedly and publicly apologised for it, and still got the Corbyn treatment. Tell me that's not factional. So this could be part of the story here as well, maybe. But there's a larger element here, given that 15% of Kernow ward are Muslim and another 40% are Jewish. The majority of voters here then. Here's the result. We'd better look at the numbers first. First and foremost, the Tories took over half the vote, 53.7% on a turnout that, although some sources are saying was high, it was actually down by 7.2%, just 32% turnout. In 2018, for example, turnout was over 48%. In 2022, it was 39%. Labour lost over 13% of their vote. The Lib Dem vote appears to have completely collapsed to the Tories, and there is a reason for that, which I'll come to. The Greens didn't have a bad showing, all other things considered. So apathy has become more significant, it would appear. And the feeling is this is because much of the Muslim vote basically stayed at home. Labour's shameless support for Israel against Gaza, a huge issue nationwide. But the more multicultural an area, the bigger the impact that has. And in London, as multicultural as you get, you simply can't take sides like that when you have to have broad appeal across all manner of demographics, not least the religious and ethnic ones. Of course, for as much as Starmer supports Israel and conflates that with Judaism, as Zionists do, much of the Jewish population here in Kernow are Haredi Jews, Orthodox Jews, who are much more likely to be anti-Zionist. So siding with Israel isn't going to win Starmer brownie points with his Middle East attitude, as it is with that demographic either. In fact, the Jewish vote had a Jewish candidate to vote for here, the former Lib Dem candidate turned Tory, Ian Shearer, hence why the Lib Dem vote trotted off to the Tories. The thought of ever voting Tory would be anathema to me, but not to Liberal Democrats, it would seem. So the Jewish vote has ended up bolstering the Tories, and is likely what got them over the line here. Shearer was also a former councillor on Hackney Borough Council, it would appear, before he got ousted in 2018 by Labour winning all 3 of the available seats for Kernow. Corbyn was such a loser though, wasn't he? All 3 seats were Lib Dem before him, and they made them all Labour. It's only under Starmer that Labour is now losing these seats again, and for the first time ever, a Tory has now won one of them, albeit a former Lib Dem. That Corbyn victory, incidentally, was largely due to young Haredi Jews out campaigning on housing issues, but you know, he was such an anti-Semite, wasn't he? So a lost Muslim vote and a shifted Jewish vote, and this isn't unique to Kernow either. The reason the vacancy came up here to begin with was because one of Labour's councillors stepped down to become mayor of Hackney, her predecessor there resigning after having been caught partying with the Labour councillor Thomas Dewey, later convicted for possession of indecent images of children, the story of which I've covered previously. But Labour held the mayoralty, and on a much reduced majority as a result. So reputationally, Labour are suffering in this area, not just because of the international stance of the party regarding Israel and Gaza, Starmer's stance basically, but also reputationally locally, and that was also a factor this time around in Kernow, as Labour ended up suspending their candidate, Laura Pascal, over transphobic social media content. A pinned tweet of hers said that trans women are not female, by definition they are male, only for Labour to reinstate them 24 hours before people went to the ballot, because winning, they clearly decided, was more important to them than responsibility or discipline in Labour, depending on whether or not you're a rotten lefty, of course. But surely there aren't many of those left in Labour anymore. Kernow, it can largely be argued, therefore, was a masterclass in incompetence by Labour. On a local front, they reinstated a candidate who had massive questions to answer on their transphobic conduct hours before the polls opened. On an international stage, which, given the high number of Jewish and Muslim voters who will, understandably, given what I've already detailed, be mainly critical of Israel and be pro-Palestinian, would not have supported Labour, led as they are, carrying the views they are on that situation, a position that is unlikely to shift for as long as Keir Starmer is the leader. We're told Labour currently have a 27-point lead over the Tories in national polls, yet in one of their safest seats, as Diane Abbott's is, they can lose a council seat to a Tory of all people right now. Yes, the candidate was awful, the Labour candidate. Most candidates under Starmer are going to be, though. But I wouldn't put any faith in national polling figures whatsoever, because the Muslim and Jewish voting shift is not in any way being replicated in those polling numbers. And if the Tories of all parties right now are capable of winning seats like this, off Labour, in Labour seats like this, then Starmer really had better not be measuring up the curtains in number 10 just yet. That Jewish vote shift cannot be overstated either. Kernow is home to one of the largest Haredi Jewish communities in Europe. Starmer is Mr. I beat anti-Semitism, and he still lost their vote. Doesn't that tell you something? It was a progressive vote that won Casino for Labour to begin with. Now it is losing it to anything but progressive leadership or candidacies, because there's nothing progressive about Labour anymore at all. So what's the difference between them and the Tories? Underlining that, along with the fact Starmer is unlikely, is frankly incapable of winning these votes back at a local level at least, I think he's unlikely to win these votes from religious demographics back in a general election either. It's the fact Starmer has now binned the long-held Labour view of recognising a Palestinian state going to affect things. I think so. He's right up there with Netanyahu's recent proclamation then on this, on the same side as he is on this issue of a Palestinian state. Quite the vote-winning position there, as I covered in this video here, which I highly recommend you watch next, and I will hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so Iran has just captured a US oil tanker, and if you listen to Western media, you'd think Iran did this to deliberately escalate tensions in the region, and, well, there might be an element of that, of course, but the trouble with that reasoning is that Iran have done this under the jurisdiction of a court order. So the capture of this vessel is completely legal. Now, the US might complain and kick off and find fault over this. They may choose to not recognise the order that allowed the Iranian Navy to take this vessel into custody. But given the stunt they pulled last year with this same vessel, they might not want to complain too loudly. Right, so this story made me smile in a wry kind of a way, because if there's anything that will get America wailing quickly and loudly, it's taking oil away from them. The Middle East is oil rich. So much of what we're seeing today happening out there, Gaza and Israel, even that reputedly has its links to oil. A large oil field off the Gazan coast that they are prevented from accessing, the Gazan people themselves. But this story, from just over a week ago now, has flown largely under the radar, which when you consider it involves oil, is a little bit surprising. So what's the story then, Damo? Well, this is a story of a court order, certainly, oil, definitely, theft, definitively, and some revenge mixed with a bit of Middle Eastern intervention following US and UK attacks on those Iranian-backed Houthis in Yemen, quite possibly. The ship in question, an oil tanker that was en route to Turkey, is the Marshall Islands registered St. Nicholas, and it's captured by Iran on January 11th amidst attacks on the Houthis in Yemen, coinciding with those bombing attacks by the US and UK last week, has led to accusations of this being Iran sticking its beak in where it shouldn't be. But there's more to it than that. You see, last year, this same ship, though under a different name, called the Suez Rajan as it was at that point, was captured by the US under an alleged sanctions enforcement operation. And what the US did was take the tanker back to Texas, offload the 800,000 barrels of Iranian crude oil it was carrying, and kept it. So what have Iran done then? Well, they've obtained a judicial order to seize this very same vessel, having just left Iraq, carrying crude oil from there bound for Turkey. The ship now renamed St. Nicholas, and they've taken it back to Iranian ports. And I have to say, I do love how Iranian media are choosing to tell this story. The Fars news agency, the news outlet for the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, so bear that in mind, have described capturing the St. Nicholas like this. The Iranian Navy said in a statement that the Suez Rajan oil tanker had stolen the oil cargo belonging to Tehran under the guidance of the United States and transferred it to an American port. Back in April 2023, Washington illegally seized a vessel carrying Tehran's oil under the guise of a sanctions enforcement operation. In late August, the US Navy unloaded the tanker's stolen Iranian oil worth around $56 million off the Texas port. This was not the first time, though, that Washington resorted to such foolhardy adventurism, stealing oil and blatantly bragging about it. The quintessential US banditry and thuggery have been on display on many occasions in recent years. Iranian officials strongly condemned the US act of piracy, warning that Tehran won't let the illegal action remain unpunished. They cautioned Washington that the era of hit and run has come to an end, stressing that Tehran will not stand idly by in relation to any violation of the nation's rights. They stressed acts of trespassing on tankers carrying Iranian oil are clear example of piracy, reminding the parties that have plans to confiscate Iran's oil to review the history of Tehran's actions in similar cases. The Navy statement added that the tanker, renamed St. Nicholas, was seized on Thursday with a judicial order and in retaliation for the theft of Iran's oil by the US. Sounds like we can expect Iran to keep the oil then. The US called this theft. Last year Iran called what the US did theft. It's tit for tat. It's the same old story over oil. The Iranian ambassador to Venezuela was quoted by another Iranian media outlet, IRNA, the Islamic Republic News Agency, which is the government-controlled news outlet of Iran. So again, more caveats for that. But the ambassador, Hojat Soltani, and let's face it, Venezuela has oil issues with the US going back years as well, as many of us full well know. Well, he said in a tweet, in May 2023, the Yankees stole a shipment of Iranian oil with a North American tanker. Yesterday, the Iranian Navy proceeded to seize the same tanker. This means strategic patience. We have maintained patience, yet we never forget. It does smack of a revenge attack when it's put like that, really, doesn't it? It also makes a bit of a mockery of maritime law, though. If the US can nick oil under the guise of a military operation, and Iran can do likewise the following year to the same ship, so no sense of irony lost, with an Iranian court order permitting them to do so. But doesn't this just reinforce how big a problem the West are making for themselves in the Middle East, already unpopular as they have been, and especially since the nations of the Middle East are so much better able to retaliate? The Gulf of Oman, as this incident happened in, runs along the eastern side of the Arabian Peninsula, as well as the Red Sea, which forms the western side of the Arabian Peninsula, and it's a whole area we know is rich in oil and all necessary to global trade, certainly in keeping the overhead costs down associated with global trade. Are basically going to become no-go zones now, and for what? Again, the reasoning all these countries can right now point to for how they interact with Western shipping, particularly now that the US and the UK is the situation in Israel and Gaza, and the fact the West are still even now siding with Israel and allowing this genocide to go on, even to the point they've now attacked the Iran-backed Houthis in Yemen, which has just made the situation for Western trade, Western vessels, even worse. Would this have happened if a ceasefire had been instigated, this theft of this tanker, if the US weren't constantly vetoing it? Now, at the point we're waiting for the World Court to issue a ruling Israel have already said they're going to ignore, with other countries now joining them in that view. Stupid isn't the word. At what point does backing Israel end up no longer worth it? At what point will that come? Tens of thousands of people being killed in Gaza already hasn't done it. Pledging to ignore the rule of law even, so economic sanctions by the Middle East against the West, is it now then, is it? Can we expect more of that? And frankly, what can we do about it if the Middle East do go down that road? You start a firefight around oil tankers? Well, we know what will happen there, don't we? They have the West, if you'll excuse the pun, over a barrel here, don't they? Well, the US response, consisting mainly of whinging about all of this, seems to bear that out. The US Navy's 5th Fleet Commander, Vice Admiral Brad Cooper, has said, Iran's actions are contrary to international law and threaten maritime security and stability. Nah, sorry, Brad. They had a court order. Now, you might not recognise the court that issued that order, but they do. And this is the rub, isn't it? The Pentagon has weighed in as well. They really have had their noses put out of joint in the US, haven't they? Their spokesman said, when asked what America was going to do about this and would they make such actions public, I'm not going to telegraph, forecast or speculate on any potential future operations, and I think that the statement from multiple nations when it comes to the fact there will be consequences should the Houthi attacks not stop speak for itself. And they also said, we call on Iran to release the tanker and the crew immediately. Clearly this activity is contrary to international law. It's another example of Iranian malign activity threatening security and stability in the region. Consequences and bringing up the Houthis. Does that imply the US will take their ire over this tanker out on the Houthis again? None of this is frankly diffusing the situation, of course. The US and Iran cannot stand each other. That's hardly news. They've been at each other's throats for decades. They need little excuse to have a go at each other. However, the US cannot cry foul and point to international maritime law to suit itself when it has itself been stealing oil, and Iran in this case has stolen some back, and both are alleging the law was on their side to do it. Well, international maritime law has to be adhered to by everyone and enforced in the same way, and clearly that is not the case, otherwise we wouldn't be here, would we? This is, if anything, a separate issue from Israel, but the question has to be asked, would Iran have bothered about this ship, oil-rich a nation as they nonetheless are, if not for what was going on in Israel right now? Who can say? But the obvious starting point to calming things down is a ceasefire in Gaza. The US should think more about that, and less about its own embarrassment about Iran getting one over on them. Sadly, this is far from the only escalation involving Iran and the US, as they've issued warnings to both the US and the UK regarding tying themselves to Netanyahu's destiny, whatever that might mean. And, well, if If you really want to know, you should watch this video here next, and I'll hopefully see you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so just days after saying that Labour will not recognise the existence of a Palestinian state unless it is okay with Israel first, Keir Starmer has, as he always does when the wind blows in his face, or in this case, public opinion on such matters blows up in his face, completely U-turned on this, now saying Palestinian statehood is the inherent right of the Palestinian people. Did you suddenly realise that you were losing votes over this ridiculous stance? Did someone with some discernible legal ability, something Starmer seems to sorely lack despite being the former Director of Public Prosecutions, suddenly inform you that there was no basis for such thinking in international law and was actually in violation of human rights? You were a human rights barrister once upon a time, right? Or have you got some kind of a, I don't know, split personality disorder that sees you swing from one dishonest mass of imbecile enthusiasms to another position of paralysing stupidity within a couple of days? He has all the integrity of an overdunked rich tea biscuit. It's a bit of an irony that a man so widely disliked by so many people switches from what he thinks is one populist position to another when he's anything but popular. But it just goes to show that he actually stands for nothing and will say or do whatever it takes to get himself into power, which is precisely why he should never get anywhere near it. Right, so Keir Starmer has now switched from refusing to recognise a Palestinian state unless Israel supports it, granting powers to Israel over the land and people they occupy and have occupied illegally for decades that they neither deserve nor should have, in full-on Zionist without equivocation mode as he was, to seeing that view go down like a cup of cold sick with the nation, not to mention many members of his own party. This has all come out in an interview with ITV News, as it happens, where he went ahead and unwisely said, "The comments from Prime Minister Netanyahu are unacceptable and they're wrong. Palestinian statehood is not in the gift of a neighbour. It's the inalienable right of the Palestinian people. It's also the only way to secure settlement and a secure future. But they're wrong. They're unacceptable. A Labour government would work with international partners to that two-state solution, a safe and secure Israel alongside a viable Palestinian state." Just days ago he was saying that he would only recognise a Palestinian state if Israel agreed to it, formally binning his party's decades-long position of recognising a Palestinian state should it come to power. He literally binned this as Labour official party policy just last Tuesday. So what's changed since last Tuesday that could warrant this full-on U-turn on this issue then? Israel is still bombing Gaza, innocent people are still dying, still being denied aid, still being denied shelter, still having their basic rights denied to them. Nothing happening in Gaza has changed since last Tuesday to force Starmer into what looks like a total retreat. Seemingly, we are taking his word here for it anyway, seems like a total retreat. So there's no guarantees he means anything at all by this, because it is just his word. But he clearly wants us to think as much. Therefore, the only answer can be, there's a political reason behind all of this. We're in an election year, aren't we? This has proven unpopular. We'd better row back on it. It's only words, though. If that's enough to fool you, then we'll fool you. Until and unless he reinstates Palestinian state recognition as official Labour Party policy that he undid earlier this week, it's meaningless. Nobody in their right mind should take Keir Starmer at his word because the man lies like a rug. It's pretty obvious that it has to be people power, public opinion that has swung this. Because he's gone from Israel having a final say on a Palestinian state to Palestinians having an inalienable right to statehood that is not the gift of a neighbour. The hypocrisy is just staggering. Israel have repeatedly said they won't accept, ever, a two-state solution now, despite pretending otherwise for years. This has come from Netanyahu himself, to the Israeli ambassador to the UK, Zippy Hotovely, to the hard right of Netanyahu's cabinet, your Ben Gavirs and your Smotriches. Israel do not want a Palestinian state. They want those people gone, relocated or wiped out. They don't care which. Seems to see it as their right to do that. It is not, and they can't keep being allowed to hide behind their religion to excuse that either. Functionally, I think the penny has dropped in Starmer's brill-creamed head that this is a vote loser and he can't afford to lose votes. Headline voting intention even, I don't buy. I think Starmer has alienated far more voters and voting demographics than polling is indicating, and things in reality are far tighter for him than the media are telling us it is. For as long as he needs our votes, he's going to bend to public pressure and bend to public will. But once he's got our votes, once he's got into power, he no longer will, and he will not care what we think. This is a massive warning sign that he shouldn't be allowed anywhere near power. Of course, I'm far from the only person pointing out Starmer's two-faced shamelessness here. Social media has had a bit of a mini meltdown over it. Humanity United has said, "I absolutely hate this man. Nothing about him is genuine, and he changes by the hour. Not a backbone, no firm position, zero policies that are different to Conservatives. Not an ounce of credibility sleepwalking into an election. At least the Conservatives are out loud and proud that they are devils. Can't trust the silent but deadly Labour government." Game of Thrones actor Miltos Yerolimiou said, "This fraud revoked a long-standing Labour policy to recognise the state of Palestine. He just makes up a different answer for whoever is asking the question. And you think it's a good idea to make him PM? Really?" And Ashok Kumar said, 2 months ago, to detract from his claim that Israel can cut off food and water, he announced he'd recognise a Palestinian state. Then 2 days ago he said that was conditional on Israel. That was 1 day before Israel said they wouldn't. Now he's saying he would again. LOL, what a weirdo. And that raised another interesting point, which I'd forgotten as I was writing this. Not that the bit about Starmer claiming Israel had the right to cut off food, water and medical aid from Gaza. We will never forget that, nor the ensuing slew of resignations from Labour members and councillors alike in utter disgust at it. But that he pledged his devotion to a Palestinian state then, when he backtracked over those comments. He still has never apologised for making them, I might add. So that actually means he pledged his support to a Palestinian state. Then when the furore surrounding that died down, he felt brave enough to tear up Labour's established position towards a Palestinian state. And following the fallout from this, along with saying Israel had a right to a say in the matter, he's now saying no they do not, in a bid to calm things down again, after he himself caused yet another fallout. I find it impossible to believe he doesn't know what he's doing. Understanding what he's doing, that might be slightly different. He is most likely being told what to do by others, your Mandelsons, your Blairs, your Israel lobby even. But he knows what he's doing insofar as he's got his orders, got his instructions, and he obeys that. But he keeps taking things too far because he doesn't understand it, because he's so desperately out of touch with ordinary people and public opinion, even on the matter of Israel and Gaza, that he oversteps, and then he ends up having to row back. I don't believe for one moment he believes in any of this. Once in power and no longer worried about votes, I can quite conceivably see him and his handlers, by him I mean his handlers probably, binning the notion of a two-state solution entirely. Who would put it past him or them? I don't think he means it, but then I struggle to believe anything he ever says. He's lied too often on too many things. The only thing I honestly do believe is that he will do and say whatever he thinks it will take to get him into number 10 at any cost. A power-obsessed nomarch who, once he gets there, will have no idea what to do after. But plenty of people that he surrounds himself with will, and they'll be the people actually running the country. He's right to be worried about his polling, the real numbers, not the headline figures the news quote. As this recent by-election I covered went to show, a ward in one of Labour's safest seats in the country, lost to the Tories of all people, seemingly because the Muslim and Jewish vote abandoned Labour. These are issues. Weasel words and U-turns won't be able to fix these issues. You should probably watch this video next, in which case, and I'll hopefully see you on the next vid. Cheers, folks. Right, so Israel is going to be dragged back to the International Court of Justice in a completely separate case from the one they are currently involved in with South Africa, and on completely separate charges as well. I commented when covering the South African litigation that in their case, they had only taken charges back to October the 7th, and that left a large amount of scope for another nation or nations to possibly come in and go back further. And indeed, that is exactly what appears to have happened. Indonesia is the nation dragging Netanyahu and co back to The Hague, or planning to at this point. The case is still being put together very much. We're very early doors, although we do have a date set with this news. But their intention is to bring this also makes Indonesia the first Muslim country to take Israel to court, which is also significant and on a certain level entirely appropriate too. They are also not doing it alone, their case being supported by Slovenia, making this the first time a European nation will be involved in a lawsuit versus Israel. And there's another case in the offing aside from this one too. There is a growing international consensus that it is way past time this Western-backed Zionist project called Israel was held account for its actions, finally. Right, so as we all await a decision by the International Court of Justice regarding the provisional order requested by South Africa, demanding amongst other things an immediate ceasefire, a couple of other countries plan on keeping the ICJ busy with Israel for a little while longer. Indonesia, supported by Slovenia, are building a case against Israel that will effectively build on that which South Africa brought, in that they're going back before the events of October 7th, a lot further. Indonesia will effectively be building a case against Israel for the last 75 years of occupation and genocide since the Nakba of 1948. That is a lot of work. They don't have a lot of time to put it all together either. They will be presenting their case to the ICJ on February the 19th, so months' time, basically. The Indonesian Foreign Minister Retno Marsudi said of this case, "International law must be upheld. The right of the Palestinian people to self-determination must be respected. Israel's occupation of Palestine, which has lasted for more than 70 years, will not erase the right of the Palestinian people to independence. Israel's invalid actions must be stopped, and there needs to be accountability for the violations of the law that have occurred. Countries must cease their support for Israel. The international community, including the UN, must not recognise the legality of Israel's action." Her Slovenian counterpart Tanja Fajon added, "This is a very broad spectrum of alleged violations that have been committed in the region for decades and whose horrific consequences are still visible today." Absolutely agree with them both. If the Palestinian people are supposedly in possession of the same human rights as the rest of us have under international law, then that should be upheld, surely. Instead, we've seen the total opposite, and an Israeli state so emboldened by the fact they never are held to account under international law, under human rights law, that they have freely referred to Palestinian people as human animals, and their most moral army, the IDF, freely film themselves desecrating personal possessions and laughing about it. And their president is even happy to be filmed or photographed signing warheads to be dropped on Gaza. Well, he's coming a cropper over that for himself, but that'll have to wait for another video. This free pass on human rights abuses that Israel keeps getting, though, has to end. There's a key difference in this case as opposed to South Africa's, though, which is that South Africa brought a legally binding case against Israel, and the Indonesian and Slovenian case will only be advisory. And this is because it is building on, in fact, a request by the United Nations General Assembly back in December of 2022, which requested that the ICJ issue an opinion on whether Israeli policies against Palestinians violated international law. And this followed a UN Human Rights Council investigation of violations and abuses of human rights law in the occupied Palestinian territories. And, well, of course, they found plenty of evidence for that. A motion to put this request to the ICJ passed 156 to 6 with 25 abstentions. And this, of course, was back in 2022, when the world was still basically fawning over Israel, eyes not yet having really been opened like they are now. But it's only now in this era of social media, where we're not reliant on biased mainstream media to inform us, and that we can inform ourselves, that the truth has come out, and people are rightly demanding something be done about this rogue state and its conduct towards a land and people that is occupied for decades. So what does it mean to only be advisory then? Well, whatever the finding of the ICJ, it won't be legally binding. And an Indonesian international law expert called Hikmahanto Juwana spelt it out. He said, "The hurdle is, of course, the advisory opinion is not the same as an ICJ court decision. An advisory opinion has only a moral binding, and this is addressed to the organs of the United Nations, which in this case the address would be the United Nations General Assembly. Secondly, if the ICJ make an advisory opinion, and if it is in favour of the people of Palestine, the question is whether Israel will observe the advisory opinion. Will Israel state that yes, Israel has occupied Palestine illegally? Because that is the main question being asked of the ICJ. Morally binding only. Do Israel have the morals? They do like talking about morals, don't they? Their most moral army again. But this also shows what Indonesia and Slovenia are trying to achieve here. They are attempting to get an opinion from the World Court on the legality of Israel's occupation of Palestine. It is, of course, illegal under international law. This has been ignored for decades. Yet despite this only being advisory, a decision from the ICJ going Palestine's way would echo around the world. The legality or illegality of Israel's occupation would be there for all to see in black and white, and no longer, frankly, a matter of dispute. For Israel to refuse to leave Palestine, to cede control of the territories, would effectively render any further support for them a violation in the eyes of most people around the world. Now, I'm not a law expert. The question I have in my mind right now, which someone watching might care to answer who knows more than me, would be as to whether anything legally binding can be built on as a result of an advisory ruling. It's for Israel to choose to listen to this ruling if it goes against them. If they don't, can some form of legal censure follow for them illegally occupying territory or continuing to do so? I'm also wondering what is taking Syria so long to join in on this. Israel also occupied the Golan Heights. Do they not want them back? Ultimately, though, if Israel choose to ignore this advisory ruling, they will truly be a pariah state in the eyes of the world, and those still insisting on supporting them will find themselves more and more alone and isolated in their opinions. So I'm looking at you, Genocide Joe, Anthony Blinken, Rishi Sunak, Keir Starmer, Ursula von der Leyen and more. Increasingly, they will be in the minority. So yes, absolutely looking forward to what comes out of this. But even this isn't the end of the litigation facing Israel, as a case for crimes against humanity even, is being taken to the International Criminal Court, also based in The Hague, this time by Mexico and Chile. Now, where the ICJ is an instrument of the UN, the ICC is independent of the UN, and where the ICJ brings rulings against whole countries, as demonstrated in the South Africa versus Israel case, and now this Indonesia and Slovenia versus Israel case, the ICC brings prosecutions against individuals, and these can be for war crimes or crimes against humanity. Now, this one will be interesting because Israel is not under the jurisdiction of the ICC, but Palestine is. They've been a member state of the ICC since 2015. And this follows submissions to the ICC regarding Israel from a number of other countries now: Bangladesh, Bolivia, Comoros, Djibouti, and South Africa. I have to mention something about Djibouti here, actually. It's notable they've done this, since the US wanted to cite rocket launchers to strike the Houthis in Yemen in Djibouti, since it is the country in East Africa on the other side of that narrow 16-mile wide strait where Yemen have been blocking Israeli shipping, the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, meaning there are literally no friends of Israel on either side of that narrow body of water. But there we are. So anyway, it'll be interesting to see who they choose to prosecute and what strength that prosecution will have, given Israel aren't under the jurisdiction of the ICC. And it piles more weight on the ICC chief prosecutor, a chap called Karim Khan, who has for months now faced accusations of having pro-Israel bias himself for dragging his feet over these referrals. It's inexcusable. He should be doing his job. If he doesn't get on with it shortly, people will rightly be asking even more questions as to why that is. Israel is a country that right now would rather abandon its own people taken hostage by Hamas than consider a ceasefire, as Benjamin Netanyahu has just proven if you watch this video next. You can find out all about that. Hardly the actions of a country or individual, frankly, that deserves to dodge a day in the dock. And I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.